And I'd like to share a story with you that exemplifies that greater wisdom at work regarding this invitation. Sid Faulkner shared with me a story from an article this week in the Wall Street Journal. It was a story about a woman who had stage 3 colon cancer, and she was invited to join a meaning-based support group, a therapy group. And the premise of this group was that you and I can endure great suffering when we find meaning in our lives. You and I can endure tremendous suffering when we know that our lives are meaningful. The woman at the center of the story, her name was Midge Wilker. And she was overwhelmed at the beginning of the article with grief at her diagnosis. She would cry in her doctor's offices. She did not want to leave her apartment. In fact, she just wanted to get on with it. She said in the article, "I just wanted to jump into the grave and get over with it." And then she honored this invitation. She was asked to join this group and to see what might happen as she worked through its different steps. As the group gathered, they began to acknowledge life itself and the gift of life itself. They began to reflect on what their lives were like before cancer and then after diagnosis. They began to think about their families, both immediate and extended families, and the gifts that they were in terms of those moments of love to cherish. And then they also honored courageous moments in their lives, times that they could claim that they were courageous people that could face insurmountable obstacles. When they had honored this part, this dimension of their life, they began to then work with the limitations created by life itself. Limitations such as, is it possible for one to have a meaningful death based on the choices we make or the meaning we carry into it? Is it possible for us to distinguish between dying with cancer and living with cancer? Is it possible for us to leave a legacy? That last question came with a homework assignment, which was to create a legacy project for your life. One woman in the group, her identity was completely around cooking, and yet cancer had taken away her ability to use her arm. And she was really grieving this loss. And as she came to this moment of thinking about leaving a legacy, she decided to turn to her daughter. And she asked her, "Would you mind if I taught you to cook? Could I pass along the recipes of my families so you can carry this legacy, this tradition that is so important to me?" Imagine that mother and daughter bonding that happened around that moment. Midge Wilker decided to be the courageous person that her friends and family decided that she was. And she decided to go to her 50th grade school reunion in the midst of her chemotherapy treatments and say, "Here's who I am." And then she showed up at her meetings, one of the sessions, dressed to the nines and said, "I am this woman. I'm stylish. This is who I am." At the beginning of the article, Midge did not even want to leave her apartment. And yet by the end of the article, by the end of this moment, this transformation, Midge said to her husband, "I know this sounds crazy, but who has it better than us? We're the lucky ones. Because this process has made me come to the realization of how meaningful life is, of the gift that you and I share together." That's quite a transformation. What I appreciate about Midge is that she was willing to enter into this process without knowing where it was going to end, in the midst of fear, stepping beyond her limitations to rest, to descend in something, a greater wisdom, if you will. In Christianity, we call this process the way of Christ leading to the way of life, the way of the cross leading to the way of life. In our place of greatest fear becomes, in fact, the place and the way of salvation. Jesus' invitation to us today is not just to rest in God, but to rest into the greater wisdom of that invitation. That as we rest in God's presence, there is something that happens within us. We are transformed. We come to realize who we are called to be and to live out that truth faithfully with one another. As Jesus invites us to come away and find rest, rest from our fears, rest from our limitations, rest from our insecurities and all that we're having to carry, I encourage you to take a break, to honor that invitation. In all of your busyness, remember what it felt like to be held by the larger presence. Remember that as you enter into that place of rest, that you're trusting the work of a greater wisdom in your life. As our psalm reminds us today, God makes us lie down in green pastures. He leads us beside still waters. He revives our soul. Find a way for you this week to rest in God. I look forward to hearing about your experiences. Amen.